We live in an age of political polarization and preference bubbles, of economic change, rising threats, and a rapidly changing world. Canada needs to stay relevant. We need more smart conversations. We need to dive into critical issues and big ideas with passion and unrestrained optimism. I'm Erin O'Toole. Welcome to the Blue Skies Podcast. Welcome to Blue Skies. I'm Erin O'Toole. Today we're talking about Warriors and some of the injuries that Warriors face from their time in uniform. That uniform can be the Canadian Armed Forces, Special Forces, JTF2, CSOR, are people that breach the buildings that save lives, or that uniform can sometimes be the uniform of the gridiron, of the hockey arena, people that physically challenge themselves as part of their calling, whether it's professional sports or the profession of arms, often leave with injuries, some that are visible, some that are invisible, and some that we're just starting to learn more about. And that's what Blue Skies is going to blue sky today. We're also very fortunate that we have a great Canadian on the podcast who has the unique distinction of winning 4 Grey Cups. That's filling one whole hand with Grey Cup rings, but with 4 different CFL teams: Hamilton, Montreal, Edmonton, and Saskatchewan. Sadly, it's missing the best team, the Toronto Argos, but maybe we can talk about in that. Really happy that we're being joined today by Tim Fleiszer. Tim, welcome to Blue Skies.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, listen, I'm having you on as the executive director of the Concussion Legacy Foundation, and we're going to be talking today about some challenging issues related to concussions, related to contact, related to traumatic brain injury. And I do have a number of veterans that listen to my podcast and, make sure that you're in a good state of mind to listen to a discussion. But this discussion is intended to help, and make sure you reach out if it brings up memories of service. But I want to talk about your record, Tim, because it's an impressive one. A professional career in the CFL, a career in American NCAA and the Ivy League for Harvard Crimson, where you were a fullback at the start and you changed positions, drafted back into the CFL from Montreal. Tell me about your own personal story, because you were kind of a multi-sport athlete and then focused on football, played in incredible institution of Harvard, played in the CFL. Tell me your own story and how sports gave you that sort of purpose as a young man and led to where you are today.
So sports really, for me, started with my dad. And my dad played football at McGill. Is the only Heck Creighton Trophy winner from McGill. So most valuable player in Canadian college football. And so growing up, was always very aware of what he had done in his career. And he was great, never put any pressure on me, but gave me every opportunity. Very supportive mother, sister, great sports family all the way around. And, like so many Canadian families, constant shuttling between the football field and the hockey rink, and also played rugby and soccer and, every sport under the sun. And just always loved sports. Used to wear my Expos uniform head to toe to first grade. That was kind of my go-to clothing for first grade. And just loved every part of it, and was so thrilled to get those opportunities later in life to keep playing.
You said that you had the option of playing football for Harvard, and when you walked into Harvard Square and saw the sort of majestic campus they have, it led you on that course rather than playing in the Quebec Major Juniors and getting into the corners and being a bit of a brawler. Talk about that for a minute, because you obviously both hockey and football are very contact sports. Were you known as a sort of both a finesse and both an elbows up guy? And what drove that decision between hockey and football?
Yeah, so played at high school in Montreal at Selwyn House. Played football, hockey, and played rugby as well. And actually, rugby may have been my best sport, but there just wasn't the same opportunities in rugby for a Canadian kid as there was in hockey and football back then. And ended up going to prep school in Connecticut at Choate Rosemary Hall. and was still playing hockey and football. Had substituted rugby with track and field, and so was trying to figure out what was the better decision to keep going with football, keep going with hockey. I had done an evaluation camp, and some of the NHL scouts came and suggested to me that my best path forward would be to focus less on my hockey skills and goal scoring and more on my fighting. So I think that maybe answers your question. I was maybe a better point of attack guy. I mean, I thought I was a decent hockey player, and had some good goals and assists and point stats going for me. But I guess when you start to get to that level, the way they saw me was more for the physical things I did than the skill things I did. And so football, same thing. I used to run with the ball. I used to be a running back, and they let me do it for 1 year when I got to Harvard. But very quickly they moved me to the other side of the ball and moved me to defense, so I could go hit people, I guess.
Well, so your big choice was bruise it up in the queue or get a degree from Harvard. That doesn't seem like a tough decision to make. You told me you were the one Canadian on the football team, the Harvard Crimson, unlike the hockey team, which had a lot of Canadians on it. Tell me a little bit about that experience, because I think people don't realize the Ivy League gets its name from the sports league that those teams play in, all very elite schools where you're highest academic standing really in the world, but in North America for sure. But you're also playing sports in this sort of NCAA high level. What was it like to be a Canadian boy in that mix, and what lessons did you take from the playing field as much as you did from the classroom?
So we came in with a coach named Tim Murphy, and he was a new coach at the time. He had replaced a guy who had been a legend, who had actually at one point been the Hamilton Ticats coach. They're very interesting Harvard Hamilton Ticats connection, and so this coach Tim Murphy came in, and with him he brought just a very different style and type of recruit, and so you could really see there was a big difference between our classes that came in, versus the guys that had been there before. And so there was certainly a bit of a divide. And Coach Murphy just retired 2 years ago, and he retired as the winningest coach in Ivy League history. He's won more championships than anybody else in Ivy League history. So amazing opportunity to be part of forming the foundation of that and forming a culture that ended up, turning into a culture that lasted 30 years, which is pretty incredible. But the type of, you and I had talked about it earlier, Erin, a lot of similarities in the mindset between military folks and football players. Certainly, what you would describe as high performers, very intense guys. And, as the one Canadian there, I definitely had to hold my own, particularly as a young guy. But look, it was a wonderful experience. Some of my best friends in the world are from my days at Harvard and the Harvard football team. And so overall, just an incredible experience. And I feel very blessed to have had it.
And then you get drafted into the CFL. I love when our mutual friend Pinball Clemens tells a story about how Canadian rugby football gave the Americans American football, and they hate hearing that story. But so you left that storied institution that really is at the root of football at Harvard, and then came up to the CFL. What was that like? And we'll spend a couple minutes on your CFL career before we get into the work on brain injury. But where were you drafted? I know you played for pretty much every team. Talk about that CFL experience and how exciting it was to win 4 Grey Cups with 4 teams.
So wonderful experience. I talked about my dad earlier, and you grow up all the time hearing about my dad and his Heck Creighton trophy, and it's, well, what could I possibly do to top that? And so we had the combine out in Winnipeg that year, and at the end of the combine, Ron Lancaster, who incredible legendary coach in the
Legend.
CFL, who had been out in Edmonton, and it was his first year in Hamilton, and he came and saw me. He said, "Look, we're gonna take you first overall." And so, absolutely amazing moment going back up to my hotel room and calling my dad and saying, "Hey, I'm going to be the first overall pick." And, finally felt like I could sit at the table with him and look at him eye to eye. And of course, I don't think there was anybody in the world that was happier for me than him, right? So that was an amazing moment and a great way to get things started. And that was an absolutely phenomenal team. We made it to the Cup that year and lost on a last second field goal to Garcia and the Stampeders, but ended up coming back and winning in '99. Then went back, played in my hometown, which again, absolutely amazing experience and incredible having that Grey Cup parade in downtown Montreal with thousands of people out for that. Was amazing experience, and just wonderful being able to not just visit but to actually live in all these different communities across Canada. I mean, it's one thing to get to visit those places, quite another to live there and get to be part of the community and see the differences in our country, but also to understand the similarities and just how lucky and how blessed we are. I mean, I certainly believe that we do live in the greatest country in the world. And so that was, a really nice part of my career. But yeah, lots of fun winning those championships. And when you win championships with guys, you become bonded with them for life. And so yeah, very, very positive experience, of which I'm incredibly blessed.
Yeah, in many ways, we've been talking about the absence of Canadian patriotism lately. It's at lowest levels. What is a Canadian identity? Justin Trudeau, I'm not getting political here, but said we're the first post-national state. I don't even think he understood what that meant. But the CFL is unique. My wife Rebecca, as you know, has worked within the CFL, and I've had the good fortune of going to several Grey Cups, both with her and on my own. And there is a Canadian heritage in that is one of those unique fixtures, whether it's the horse from the Stampeders running into the Royal York Hotel, or just the sort of camaraderie and the friendly rivalry. The Labor Day Classic games. The being a brave Argo fan to go to Hamilton for the Labor Day Classic. These are all things that I think are extremely special, and I think we need to cherish more. But before we transition, I'm really glad you've spoken about your father as well, because part of character in young men is really looking up to your father, and the absence of a father can cause a whole path of difficulty for a lot of young men. But I was the same. In fact, my joke with my father, who was elected when I was in the Air Force, was how can you one up? How can you sit up at the table? Well, my dad was an MPP. I was going to try and be prime minister, and then I could sort of sit at the table and have some bragging rights. But as you said, there was no one who wanted me to win more than my father. And so, do we ever stop trying to make our fathers proud? I'm putting you on the spot here, but has that been a big motivating feature of your life? Is not only learning to emulate, respect, and learn from your father, but to 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 go that extra yard, to use an intended pun here, to take that baton from him?
Absolutely, and but proudly so. And so my dad, great football player, had some opportunities to go and play pro. Partly because I think physically he was dealing with some injuries, but also I think he just felt like it was his calling, and he decided to go become a physician. And so his background has been as a trauma surgeon. He's done some great work in oncology and teaching. And I think if you want to psychoanalyze it, part of my current efforts with the foundation, my current efforts in healthcare, is probably a way to live up to that without having to go through the arduous path of med school. It was I remember when I was a very little kid, and he used to bring me to the intensive care unit, and he'd leave me at the nurses' station. Nurses were great. They'd come and they'd bring me milk and cookies, and they'd say, "So are you going to be a doctor like your daddy when you grow up?" And I would say, "No, I'm not." From the earliest time, I'm also very fortunate. I've got a fantastic mother who's also incredibly accomplished. A woman who was able to get through McGill Med School. I think there were maybe 7 other women or 5 other women in her class, and has had an outstanding career. And she was very ahead on thinking about things like nutrition and hydration before anybody else was talking about this. And so she was a great value add to my pro career as well. And so was sitting in the Montreal General Hospital Foundation boardroom, and they said, well, your stuff's great because it brings together, our two main pillars, which is trauma and mental health. And I said, oh, okay, now I understand exactly where I'm sitting, why I'm sitting here. It just made too much sense in the context of what my dad did and what my mom is doing. And so, yeah, I think having my father's support, having my mom's support, having that family support, but also the things that you learn from them, right? Both personally and professionally. I mean, if you can take all that and apply it in a positive way to what you're doing, I mean, I think that's a magic we all aspire for.
Yes, and it's a sign of good character which you have in spades. So let's transition to here to really how we've connected and are collaborating today. Um, your time at Harvard, one of your classmates in particular helped, uh, really drive your passion to explore the issue of brain injury and concussion and some of the work that now is being done to help prevent brain injury, to recognize it, to treat it. Um, I've been saying for many years that now that society is dealing more maturely with mental health, and we're doing resilience training, we're helping people come forward faster by reducing stigma so they can get help faster and hopefully have better outcomes before that mental injury or mental condition impacts other aspects of their life. But the one area that I think we've only seen the sort of tip of the iceberg on for the Canadian Armed Forces and our veterans is traumatic brain injury, TBI, which we're starting to understand a lot more now. The US is. Tell me about your path from professional sports into being one of the leading advocates in Canada. You just testified before Parliament a couple of months ago on this issue. What was it that really got you on this path? Your teammate, and you've been able to realize you can make a difference by advocating. Tell us about how you became executive director of the Concussion Legacy Foundation.
So I was wrapping up my pro career, and I was down at Harvard Yale, and I bumped into Chris Nowinski. And Chris, after he graduated, Chris was 2 years behind me, also played on the defensive line. And after Chris graduated, he went and wrestled in the WWE with the tights, the boots, the whole thing. And we were talking earlier, Erin, and I said I didn't want to ruin it for you, but wrestling's fake. It's choreographed, but what those guys do,
Kayfabe.
that's right, is very, very physical. And Chris, unfortunately, had got hit and had suffered a series of bad concussions. Didn't really know that he had suffered those concussions. Had seen several specialists that couldn't tell him what was wrong, and he ended up in Bob Cantu's office, who's one of the top brain injury physicians in the world. And Bob, instead of asking him if he's had a concussion, asked him if he had ever experienced any of the symptoms, headaches, seeing stars, feeling dizzy, those symptoms that are now becoming more and more familiar in our culture. And Chris's answer was, well, yeah, that happens all the time. And Bob said, well, look, those are all concussions, and you're suffering from post-concussion syndrome. And Chris, being Chris, went off and said, how is this possible? Around elite athletes all the time, nobody's talking about this. And he went and he wrote a book about his experience and was able to look at all kinds of different medical journals and different sources and correctly ascertain that there was this hidden epidemic of brain injury happening right under our noses. And so he came and put his book in my hand at Harvard Yale, and I read the book and I was blown away. My thought was there's something going on here. This is serious. And at that point, I was transitioning from being a player into being a player agent. And I had the guy who had been my agent for 10 years, a gentleman by the name of Gil Scott, who's been one of the top agents in football and hockey in Canada for, I think it's almost 4 decades now. And Gil at the time came to me and had asked me to come on as his partner after I retired. And so as I retired and started becoming a player agent, Also went and was told Chris that I was happy to try and help and to try and volunteer in the short term as he was growing. The work in Boston, which is so well known now, was really in its infancy. And so I had a front row seat as that developed. And from the player agent side, I just felt like as I was going to these guys and saying, hey, I'm here to take care of you toe to head, that I better be up to speed on what was happening on the brain injury front. And so it kind of went from there. It was really very much my charitable work for years, evenings, weekends, was just sort of funding some of the stuff myself. And then as it continued to grow, and particularly as we got into the pandemic, and sports had stopped, and was starting to do less agent work with the players. I still do some work in management, and just felt like it was important that I do this work. And I mentioned my background with my parents and being around the medical community, and then having had the wonderful blessing of the experience in pro sports. The thought was, if I don't do this, who's going to? And so it's just kind of gone from there. And our foundation has grown significantly in the last couple of years. And during the pandemic, this file, I think kind of went to the bottom of the pile. But I think we've seen a resurgence, and it just sort of feels like now is the right time to finally address this in Canada.
Yeah, so some of the work you've been involved in has really transformed how we approach sports. And I think people don't really realize how much things have changed in the last, I would say, 10 years with respect to uh, reducing concussions and brain injury. There is now something called a concussion protocol when someone gets into, a physical injury or something on the field or ice that is likely leading to a concussive injury. There are now a number of steps, but that was never the case. Like when you played, um, we would have talked about somebody getting their bell rung and it would have been shake it off, get it back in. Did you see any of this sort of protocol or protective or preventative stuff when you were playing? And I think it's important for people to realize that a lot of this is very recent in terms of society taking precautions.
So no, and listen, for the times that I had concussions, I mean, there was there was very little wait time. I went back in there very quickly. I think the one exception I would say to that is one of our team doctors for the Alouettes, a guy named Scott Delaney, who's here at McGill. And Scott's currently the medical director of the NHLPA. And at the time, this is like 2000. I'm not sure if I'm in this study or not. I can't remember, but it's possible. But Chris did just, or sorry, that Scott did just what had happened to Chris, which was instead of asking athletes if they've had a concussion, he went and he started asking athletes, and it started with CFL athletes, which is why I think I was probably in that study. Started asking them if they had experienced, like listed the symptoms that are associated with brain injury, and started asking them if they'd experienced any of that. And that, what had come back, in and around, let's call it 2% of athletes of contact sports every year saying they had concussion. That number went from 2% to somewhere between 70 and 50%, right? And so, again, that's for anybody that played in there. It's not going to surprise you. We experience those symptoms all the time, and it was.
And what are those symptoms, Tim? Like just for our listeners, run through the type of things that are the indicia of a concussive injury.
So getting hit, and it doesn't need to be a blow to the head, right? I mean, there's a couple of things that people get wrong on this. One, people think you got to be knocked out to have a concussion. That's not accurate. Two, you need to be hit in the head to get a concussion. Also not accurate. You can get a hard blow to your body, and if your brain moves suddenly, that's how the injury happens. So it's associated with headache. It's associated with feeling dizzy. It's associated with confusion, nausea, acting or inappropriately. Just anything where you see any sort of intellectual disruption, right? Is somebody just feeling off, feeling in a fog. Those are all things that are associated with concussion. And when we talk to soldiers, and again, associated now more with sports and hockey, but it happens in so many other areas in life as well. And so that's the first thing when we talk to military is, well, I never had a concussion. But the other thing that's important for the public to understand, Erin, is that it's, yes, there's concussion. I'm not saying concussion's a good thing, but the broader issue is not just the concussive impacts, it's the non-concussive impacts. And so it's those impacts, think, a base block in hockey or a body check in the corner, a tackle in rugby. Again, any time that the head is shaken and an impact happens, and when you're talking about chronic traumatic encephalopathy or CTE risk, the risk is not the number of concussions you've had. It's the total number of impacts that you sustained during the course of your career. So, think about somebody who's played contact sports growing up and then gone in and served in the military, been around some of the heavy artillery, been a paratrooper, and the landings that go on with that, some of the combat training that's been done. It's those cumulative impacts that can actually put you at higher risk for mental health issues, dementia, substance abuse, anything that's associated with brain dysfunction.
Yeah, I'm going to break a bit of that down because you've gone all the way to CTE, which I think a lot of people are now starting to understand that injury and its cumulative effect. It can't be diagnosed, from what I understand, until there's actually an autopsy of the brain, right? So the CTE is something we have to prevent, but a lot of players are donating their brain after they pass for study, trying to help the very sport or profession of arms that they're working in. Um, I've actually been asked to do this as a veteran, even though I was not in a combat arms role. Um, but that there's a willingness to try and get a better understanding. But let's break this down. So now that there are concussion protocols, if somebody has one of those hits on the field or on the ice, what is the protocol meant to do? It's meant to make sure that there's enough recovery time so that they're not just going out on the next shift or the next game. Break down a bit for our listeners what what we do in the protocol so that we can help heal or at least prevent re-injury.
So what Rowan's Law does in Ontario is if a player gets hit and there's a suspected brain injury, that player should not return to the ice, the pitch, or the field until they've been cleared by a healthcare professional. And so, certainly trying to self-diagnose when you've had a brain injury is an absolutely terrible strategy. It's like asking somebody who's had some drinks if they're too drunk to drive, right? You're asking somebody who's cognitively impaired potentially to self-diagnose. Not a good idea, right?
Mhm.
So what you need in that case often is the bystander model. So a lot of the education that we do with young people is trying to teach them to look out for those symptoms, and if they think that one of their teammates has been hurt, tell the coach, tell the ref, and make sure that we get that player off the ice. So that's the first thing. If anybody in any walk of life, if there's a suspicion of a brain injury, you need to get them out of the activities that are potentially stressing the brain, get them off screens in any kind of way, away from loud noises, and have them rest until they're able to see a healthcare professional, right? Without trying to diagnose that on your own. Again, though, that's concussion is a kind of, I don't want to say a smaller part. It's only one part of what we're doing. I mean, we're very focused these days on trying to prevent some of the other things that are happening. And one of the things that we've seen in the literature is that participation in sports that exposes to kids certainly under the age of 12, and we should even consider up to the age of 14, is a terrible idea. It's the data clearly shows those kids that get exposed, that ages 6 to 12, the brain is developing. Neck strength is very low as compared to the size of head, right? Kids are like little bobbleheads, so their heads are often 80% of their adult size, where their neck strength is like 20% of what it's going to be when it's an adult. And so again, it's back to that sudden movement of the head over and over and over again. Think heading soccer balls, right? Which seems like a relatively innocuous activity. But actually, and you mentioned earlier, Erin, that I testified before Parliament, and that was my comment when I was asked, which is if there was one single policy change we could make in Canada to protect young athletes, it would be taking heading out of soccer for kids under the age of 12, and we should even think about 14. To give more time for the brain to develop and neck strength and the body to be ready to absorb those sort of impacts. And a lot of those headers are not happening on the field during a game. They're happening in practice with an adult lobbing a ball at a child. And so it's understanding that those repetitive head impacts are just bad for young athletes. Hockey Canada has actually been really good on this. They raised the age of body checking to 13 years old in 2013 after the Sidney Crosby concussion. But we have not followed suit in soccer, where in the U.S. banned headers for kids under the age of 12 in 2016. They did it last year in the UK. And so we're now behind from a policy perspective in Canada. And it just goes without saying, kids in football shouldn't be tackling before the age of 12. That shouldn't be happening in rugby. Flag is a really good option in both of those sports. And even if you don't care about kids' health or the ethics of putting kids in an activity which potentially gives them brain damage, if you want your kid to play in the NFL or the CFL, don't hit them in the head before the age of 12, and don't let them play tackle football because it ruins their reaction time. That's some of our research that we've got that we've looked at Western University with Dr. Jeff Brooks, who looked at the Western varsity football team and the effect of these non-concussive impacts on reaction time.
Yeah, so Soccer Canada has to worry less about their drones and drone training, and they got to start looking at concussion protocols and catching up with the states and the UK. I'm going to probe that a little bit more because you mentioned Rowan's Law. I'm sure most people don't know it. I'm going to give shout out to a soon-to-be retired politician, Lisa MacLeod. That was her initiative at Queen's Park. Kudos. I know Eric Lindros, great Oshawa general from my neck of the woods. He played for a few other teams, but I still consider him a general. Um, was a driving force. We've seen careers cut short. I'm sure your organization was involved as well. That was named after a young girl who died as a result of a head injury. So not only are these injuries, something we should prevent through policy, but they're having a real impact on sports now. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, Rowan Stringer, that whole situation was incredibly influential on what we do. Gordon, Kathleen, Rowan's parents have just been incredible advocates. Gord, they've both sat on my board, and Cassie, her sister, they've just done an incredible job in advancing the public's understanding in Canada. And for those that don't know, Rowan was a 17-year-old rugby player in Nepean, and she had gotten a concussion playing rugby. She had Googled concussion. She had talked about it with her friends. She did not tell the coach. She did not tell her parents. And what they decided, because she had a big game coming up, is what they decided was that she would play the game and that she would tell everybody after the game about this concussion. And she got hit again, and there's a condition known as second impact syndrome. It happens rarely, but the issue with brain injury is once you get hit, the brain is the normal functions interrupted. It becomes much more vulnerable to a second hit, and that's what happened to Rowan. And her brain swelled uncontrollably, and she ended up dying a couple of days later. And so Gord and Kathleen went and found Lisa, who was the member of provincial parliament at the time, and Lisa spearheaded the initiative, which eventually became Rowan's Law in Ontario. And for context, we have legislation in all 50 states in the U.S. In Canada, so far, we only have Ontario that has passed legislation. And listen, Aaron, I'm a fan of smaller government rather than bigger government, but we've seen incredible success with seatbelts and the seatbelt law. And so I think, one of the issues with brain injury is that it's often not taken seriously enough. And so saying we don't need a law for this because it's not serious enough is reinforcing the problem. And so our hope is that the other provinces and territories will start to look at putting forward similar legislation. I know there's been discussion in places like Manitoba and Quebec and out east, and so my hope is that, like I said, during the pandemic, this file went to the bottom of the pile, but my hope is that people will start to look at this again, because I think it's been incredibly successful in Ontario. And we're also hopeful with Bill C-277 at the federal level, which calls for a national strategy with brain injury. We're hoping that that will also help advance things from a policy and the ability to protect the public.
Yeah, what a positive legacy out of an absolute tragedy with Rowan, and I think hopefully her family have found some solace and some mission in making sure that that they can prevent these things, because not this isn't a question of big government in my view. This is a question of smart government, and this is a question of knowing that young people, especially talented in a competitive nature, will always have the next game, or there's always going to be a scout at the next game. And if we don't set up a circumstance to protect them from the competitive pressures, it's not just in pro sports; it's on the people that are on the path to pro sports. Um, we want to harness that competitive nature. In fact, we want to be more competitive as a country. But when we know there's ways that we can limit exposure to risk and damage, gosh, it's just common sense. And so it is crazy to think that the US is so far ahead of us on this issue. And thanks to your advocacy, I think we're catching up. I want to talk the last few minutes on this connection with the military and the warriors on the battlefield as opposed to the gridiron, because I've seen through my work with True Patriot Love and my time as veterans minister, the connection. You know, you and I were talking about how Mark Napier and the NHL Players Association years ago bonding with some Seesaw soldiers at the Leafs Military Appreciation Night. There's just an affinity of that sort of, you know, competitive sort of physical culture that you see in sport, that you see in the Canadian Armed Forces. There's similarly a reluctance to say that landing when you're a paratrooper didn't go well, or yeah, you're feeling the impacts of being close to an artillery firing or a shell going off. Um, Speak to me for a minute on how the Canadian Armed Forces can learn from many of these protocols, and the bill that's before Parliament can hopefully come up with a strategy where we can be much smarter at preventing that recurring injury and providing more protection as well. Because I think, in the last 10, 15 years, there's been better developments on headgear, better developments on, as you said, neck and strength training, and a number of things we can do. So I know you've made the connection between military and sports. Speak to me for a minute on how we can take this to avoid traumatic brain injury or other, mental health injuries that come as a result of brain trauma.
So you're right that there's an incredible respect between military personnel and athletes, and people have heard me tell this story before, but every year when we did the military appreciation game, and they would bring the military folks to the locker room, it was like everybody sat up straighter. Right? It's like there go the real badasses. But I gotta say, as an athlete, what we do in sports is a game, and what you guys do and what you did is for real. Right? Like there's definitely a comparison, but in my mind, I have more respect for the military guys. But there's just this really interesting interplay where, if I'm talking to an athlete, I talk about what the soldiers are doing. When I'm talking to a soldier, I talk about what the athletes are doing. Somehow that tends to be more effective. And so the genesis of all this was Anne McKee, who's the Dr. Anne McKee, who's the pathologist at Boston University. And really this started, people have seen the movie Concussion. People started this really started with athletes, and it started with NFL football players. It started with a lot of guys that had played 10, 15, 20 years. And so when Anne McKee announced in 2018 that of the first 102 military brains that she had studied, 66 came back positive for CT, I was very surprised. And so we started looking at, is brain injury an issue in the military? And as we peeled back the layers of the onion, it became obvious that it was. And started meeting with veterans. We did a symposium at Queen's University. This was 2 weeks before the pandemic hit. We had been connected with DRDC and the researchers at DRDC in advance of that, and so Ken Dryden was good enough to come and be the keynote, and we did an event at Queen's to really get people talking about brain injury in the military. And what had worked really well with the athletes was athletes pledging to donate your brain. You talked about that earlier, that you were considering doing that. And we're fortunate that we've had lots of very well-known athletes and many military folks doing that as well, and that was a great way to start to advance things or to accelerate the research and accelerate the awareness in and around brain injuries. And that's what happened. I mean, we're up. I'm proud to say we're up to 450 brain pledges from the military community, which is when you think about somebody giving a body part to support a cause. I mean, that's a real number, a substantial number, and it's a real show of support. And there's this incredible thing where the military guys want to support the athletes, and the athletes want to support the military guys. I mean, that's absolutely been a wonderful. And when you look at our staff. It's mostly former athletes or former military, and one of the things you see is we work really, really, really well in a team together, and so those are things that you learn in sports, and they're things that you learn in the military. And so I think where things really came to the head was there's a former special forces soldier named Shane Nedwin, and Shane's got on a farm up north of Edmonton, and he came forward in the Globe and Mail talking about how difficult it was to having his claim to Veteran Affairs for brain injury be denied, and the Globe and Mail wrote a story about that, and I'm pleased to say that the response from government and from the military has been swift, and I'll say even before that story, the response from government, our challenges with some of the pro sports leagues been very well documented. My experience with the Canadian Armed Forces and with Veteran Affairs has actually been the opposite, where particularly in the armed forces, they've been very attentive. I know some of those training protocols have been changed for the JTF2 guys. We recently presented to Army Council and Mike Wright, and my understanding is that they're looking at changing some of those training protocols, much like we've done in sport for the Army. And since the Globe and Mail article, it seems like Veteran Affairs is well on their way to changing some of these policies. I mean, I've been communicating regularly with Paul Ledwell, and my sense is that this is headed in a very positive direction.
Yeah, no, it is. And that Globe and Mail article, which I sent to a number of people as well, Stephanie Levitz did a great job covering the story that I think you helped highlight with Shane. The TBI issue is not properly addressed by Veterans Affairs now. It took decades to reorient service to be responsible with respect to OSIs or operational stress injuries, PTSD. I think I don't want to see the same amount of time taken to properly respond and provide benefits and medical supports for folks with TBI. I think the work you're doing, some of the awareness, there's the great folks with Buddy Check Coffee in Ottawa that do a lot of stuff on traumatic brain injury. We used to give away some Buddy Check Coffee at our mental health event on Parliament Hill. It's a great group, and folks from Dwyer Hill, the JTF2 community, are much more aware of this issue now as well, because even dealing regularly with simulated explosives and things like this, all of these potentially have a concussive effect if they're not treated carefully. So in training, for goodness sake, or in practice, you should be going the extra effort because you know sometimes in game or in combat you can't prepare as adequately. So we should certainly not be exposing people to too much repetition or injury in training in the environment. My podcast is Blue Skies, so we've been dealing with some deep topics here, and tragedy in the case of Rowan, and what we need to do to get better. And I think there's a lot of ways that the country can be a little bit better, and you're one of the leading advocates. But I'm also an optimist. So I want to, in the last sort of couple minutes, get your sense on what has been something that has been a positive change. You've talked about Rowan's Law, and I think that's a great one. Um, what's something else that you've seen advocacy from your group, from others? Society is starting to become more aware of brain injury, I believe. What's something that you can leave us with on a more positive note so that people don't get too down from this session? Yeah, there are challenges, but we're tackling those challenges in a way that I think is really, really positive. So, what's something that you're really optimistic about that we're either learning research wise or practice wise that is going to protect people?
So let me be clear. I could not be more optimistic about the direction that we're headed, both in sports and in the military, and some of the other groups that are affected. Whether it be violence survivors, accident survivors, the elderly, and what we're going to do to protect kids. Um, so in football, what we saw in the last two collective bargaining agreements in both the NFL and the CFL is there were some real limits put on contact in practice. And what we realized in football is that 80% of those impacts were happening in practice. And so that was well within our control, right? And so as coaches are becoming more and more aware, that's been the big fix for football at the pro level was reducing those total number of impacts. If you remember, we talked about concussions are not a good thing, but to me the most important part of this is the non-concussive impacts and what that means for brain injury and mental health and some of the other things that go along with that. And so same thing in the military where, I know within the Canadian Armed Forces, and we've seen this on the U.S. side as well, there was a memo that went out to the within the Department of Defense in August that talked about reducing impacts in practice, in training. And so I'm incredibly encouraged that things are going in the right direction there. I'm incredibly encouraged with Veteran Affairs' response to this thus far. Lots of work to do certainly, but again, that whole you mentioned True Patriot Love, which have been a great partner for us. We've got Invictus Games going on right now, which if you watch that opening ceremony, I mean, what an inspiring ceremony it was to see some of those guys. I mean, I think my favorite moment was when the BC Premier was talking and talking to the American athletes, and they all stood up and made heart signs, and the Canadian military got up, and with all the other nonsense that's going on in the world these days, the guys that came from a career where it's life and death, of course they cut right through it and got right to the heart of the matter. So that, you talk about something to make you optimistic. That made me feel really optimistic and inspired me over the weekend, seeing that out of the Invictus Games, which is great. And our work with the Royal Canadian Legion and Les Sanciers, I think we talked about athletes having particularly team sports athletes, just understanding how to work in teams and understanding how to work with partners. And it's the same thing in the military. So you want to talk about the optimistic part of this. It's seeing all the people that are mobilizing in sports, all the people that are mobilizing in the military to try and address this issue. And for some of the soldiers that we've been working with that suffered from symptoms of PTSD and the overlap of those symptoms with brain injury, seeing with what they've been able to do with Operation Brain Health, which encourages people to exercise and eat right and sleep properly and build their cognitive reserve, and seeing some of these guys that have brought that into their lives literally transform, it makes me very optimistic that we're going to be able to figure out solutions for this. And so I'm the coach for my kids' hockey teams. They're 9, 7, and just turned 3, all boys. My household, as you would expect, often looks like UFC or WWE, and so I am feeling very optimistic as these guys start to play sports like hockey, and they're playing flag football and they're playing soccer, that we're going to be able to continue to change some of these policies, and that for those type of folks, right, that go into the military or play sports that are high energy, high motor kids, just like my own kids, that they're going to have a much brighter future than our previous generation did. Now, that being said, with our research that we're doing at CAMH to be able to diagnose CT in vivo, I mean, this research is leading the world. And so for all of us where we can't go back and change the past, and for all of us who have been exposed to many non-concussive impacts and concussive impacts over the years, I also feel like treatment strategies are right around the corner in a way that we haven't done. So I could not be more optimistic about what the next 5 years are going to look like as we address this issue. And I think Canada absolutely has the opportunity to be the global leader in this.
The blue sky optimism quotient with that response, Tim. Thank you. And I was in Vancouver for the Invictus opening. The emotion between the American athletes and the Canadians, those hearts, that was the most powerful thing for me. And nobody knows, the importance
Oh,
of
cool.
the deep history between our two countries more than people that wore the uniforms of their country. And maybe there should be more of them in charge than some of the politicians, as they say. But look, the progress we're making is due in large part to great advocates like yourself. Um, it's been great to talk to you about some of your advocacy work, some of your own story. And Tim Fleiszer, you're not just a champion on the field, you're a champion in life. So thanks for joining us today on Blue Skies.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to Blue Skies. If you want to learn more about Tim and his work, check out the Concussion Legacy Foundation. Play a role in your own veterans group or your own civic group. Advocate provincially to make sure that we catch up to the US on some of these standards, and make sure you blue sky this wider issue with your family and friends. I'm Erin O'Toole. Thanks for tuning in.